The sun hung low over the vast expanse of Sheriff Jake Carter's farmland, casting a golden glow across the fields his family had owned for generations. It was the kind of place where time moved slow, where hard work paid off, and where a man could take a deep breath and know he was standing on something that truly belonged to him. But that peace was about to be shattered in a way that not even the town's most notorious criminals had ever managed. Jake's boot crunched against the gravel as he stepped onto his porch, flipping through his mail. A thick, official-looking envelope caught his eye. It had that unmistakable government-style print, the kind that made your stomach tighten before you even opened it. As he tore it open, his eyes scanned the words, and his heart did something it hadn't done in years. It stopped for half a second before slamming against his ribs. Notice of sale. His land. Sold. His stomach churned. It had to be some kind of mistake. His name wasn't anywhere on the approval forms, but there was a stamped signature. A forgery so sloppy that it would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. The document claimed his land had been rezoned, sold to a development company, and he had exactly 48 hours to vacate before construction crews arrived. His grip on the paper tightened, his knuckles turning white. He took a slow, deep breath, forcing his pulse to settle. He had dealt with bank robbers, drug dealers, and every kind of criminal you could imagine, but this was something else. This was personal. And the worst part? Whoever had pulled this off thought they could get away with it. That's when he noticed the signature at the bottom. Karen Thompson. His lips pressed into a thin line. He had heard the horror stories about the town's infamous HOA president, a woman who ran the neighborhood like her own little kingdom, making up rules as she went, fining people for the color of their curtains, and once even banning a man from putting up Christmas lights because they were too cheerful. But this was a whole new level of insanity. Jake didn't waste any time. He grabbed his hat, swung himself into his truck, and headed straight for the HOA's office, a gaudy little building in the middle of town that looked more like a personal shrine to Karen's ego than an actual workplace. The moment he stepped inside, he was met with the sound of laughter. A small group of board members stood near the counter, sipping expensive coffee and flipping through documents like they were picking out which mansion to buy next. And there she was, Karen herself, standing at the center of it all, wearing her signature smug smile, a stack of papers in her perfectly manicured hands. "Ah," she said, not even bothering to hide her condescension as she looked him up and down. "You must be Mr. Carter. I was wondering when you'd show up." Jake took his time, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone shift uncomfortably. Then, with the slow precision of a man who knew exactly how to control a room, he set the letter down on the counter. "You want to tell me why I just got a notice saying my land was sold?" Karen gave a little laugh, shaking her head. "Oh, you poor thing. I know legal documents can be confusing, especially for someone who, well, spends most of his time out in the fields. But don't worry. Everything is completely above board." Jake held her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Above board?" "Yes," she chirped. "The land was sitting there, completely unused. It was just a matter of making things more productive. You should be thanking me. Do you have any idea how much the town is going to profit from this development? And honestly, you should have been keeping up with your zoning regulations. That land technically fell under our jurisdiction." He let out a slow breath through his nose. "It's my land. And last I checked, it's not part of your HOA." "Not anymore," Karen said with a smirk. "The paperwork says otherwise." Jake's hand curled into a fist, but he kept his voice calm. "Where's the sale approval with my signature?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, don't be difficult. These things happen all the time. It's a formality. The county approved it, the developer signed off, and the land is already in transition. You really don't have a say in it anymore." He took a step forward, resting both hands on the counter, his voice dropping to a level so low and dangerous that the entire room seemed to shrink. "You forged my name on a legal document. That's fraud." Karen's smile wavered just slightly before she forced a laugh. "Oh, come on now. No need to get all dramatic. If you really want to fight it, take it up with the courts. But I'll warn you, our legal team is the best money can buy, and I highly doubt some small-town sheriff has the resources to go against us." The room went dead silent. Karen blinked. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Jake let the weight of his words settle before pulling out his badge and setting it down on the counter. "I am the sheriff. And you just admitted to a felony. The color drained from Karen's face so fast it was almost comical. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. One of the board members let out a strangled cough. Another took a quiet step back, suddenly very interested in the floor. Jake straightened, picking up the fraudulent document and folding it neatly. "This," he said, waving it slightly. "This is evidence. And if you think your legal team is going to get you out of this, you're more delusional than I thought." Karen finally found her voice, but it was higher now, thinner. You can't just." "I can. And I will," Jake interrupted. Here's the thing. You didn't just mess with some random farmer. You didn't just steal a couple of acres for some overpriced condos. You tried to steal from the sheriff of this town. And I promise you that was the dumbest mistake you've ever made." For the first time, Karen's confidence cracked. Her hands clenched the edges of the counter, her nails digging into the wood. "You can't prove anything." Jake gave her a slow, knowing smile. "Karen, you signed my name on a legal document. You left a paper trail so sloppy it might as well have been a confession. And I guarantee you, once I start digging, I'm going to find a whole lot more dirt than just this." Karen swallowed hard, her entire posture shifting from arrogant to panicked in the span of seconds. Jake tipped his hat. "See you real soon." And with that he turned on his heel and walked out, leaving Karen standing there, pale as a ghost, knowing her reign over this town was about to come crashing down around her. Jake knew that taking Karen down wouldn't be as simple as slapping cuffs on her and dragging her to jail. People like her always had tricks up their sleeves, and he had no doubt she'd try to weasel her way out of this mess. That was fine. He had no problem playing along for a while, letting her dig the hole even deeper. He spent the next few hours gathering everything he needed. First, he made copies of the fraudulent documents, ensuring he had enough evidence to take to the judge. Then he put in a call to the county clerk's office, where a friendly voice confirmed what he already suspected. There had been no official rezoning, no legal sale, and certainly no authorization from his office. Karen had completely fabricated the entire thing, relying on her influence and a handful of corrupt officials to push it through. By the time he was done, the sun had set, and the distant glow of headlights flickered against the horizon. The construction crew had arrived, their trucks and bulldozers rumbling toward the land they thought they owned. Jake leaned against his truck, arms crossed, watching as a man in a tailored suit stepped out of a black Mercedes. Greg Tinsley. The developer. The kind of man who smelled like overpriced cologne and arrogance. Greg spotted Jake and strode toward him with a grin that was equal parts charm and condescension. "You must be the former landowner," Greg said smoothly. "I hope there's no hard feelings. These kinds of things happen all the time. Progress waits for no man after all." Jake let the words hang in the air before finally replying, his voice as steady as ever. "Funny thing about progress. It's supposed to be legal." Greg's smile faltered for the briefest second before he laughed, shaking his head. "Look, I understand you're upset, but this has already been settled. We have all the proper paperwork, all the right approvals. There's really nothing to discuss." Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, offering it to Greg. "Go ahead. Take a look." Greg hesitated before taking the document, unfolding it with a smirk that quickly disappeared as he read the words. His face turned a shade paler as he looked up. "This is a court order," Greg said, his voice suddenly lacking its previous confidence. "That's right," Jake confirmed. "Halting all construction until the investigation is complete. And considering the fact that the sheriff's office is leading that investigation, I'd say you have a real problem on your hands." Greg scoffed, shoving the paper back at Jake. "This is ridiculous. The land was purchased fair and square." "Was it?" Jake asked, tilting his head. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're about to build a country club on stolen property. And if you don't turn those trucks around, every single one of your workers is going to be charged with trespassing. Including you." Greg's jaw tightened as he glanced back at the construction crews. The workers were watching the exchange closely, waiting for instructions. He muttered a curse under his breath before turning on his heel, marching back toward his car. He wasn't going to fight this out in the open, but Jake could already tell he wasn't giving up that easily. As Greg sped off, Jake turned his attention back to the property. The construction crew hesitated for a moment before, one by one, they started backing up their trucks. They weren't stupid. They weren't about to get arrested for someone else's mistake. But Jake knew the fight was far from over. The next morning as he walked into his office, he wasn't surprised to find Karen waiting for him. She was perched in one of the chairs across from his desk, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her expression one of barely concealed fury. "You've really overstepped, Sheriff," she said the moment he stepped inside. Jake shut the door behind him and took his time hanging his hat on the rack before finally looking at her. "Funny. I was just about to say the same to you." Karen scoffed, shaking her head. "Do you have any idea how much trouble you're causing? Do you even understand the kind of people you're messing with?" Jake let out a slow breath, stepping around his desk and lowering himself into his chair. "Karen, let's cut the nonsense. You and I both know you forged my signature. You sold land that wasn't yours to sell and you did it thinking no one would fight back. Now you're realizing just how wrong you were." Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't know what you think you know, but I promise you I've done nothing illegal. And you don't have a case." Jake leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "Is that so?" Karen smirked. "That's right. You might have gotten some judge to stall construction, but that's all it is. A stall. Once we sort this out, the project will move forward and there's nothing you can do to stop it." Jake studied her for a long moment before finally reaching into his desk drawer and pulling out a second stack of papers. He slid them across the desk toward her. "Go ahead," he said. "Take a look." Karen hesitated before snatching up the papers, scanning them quickly. As her eyes moved across the page, the color in her face drained little by little. This, she started, her voice suddenly less sure of itself. This is nonsense." Jake nodded. "It's a full financial audit of the HOA's accounts. A little something I requested when I started digging into your history. See, Karen, I had a hunch this wasn't the first time you pulled something like this. Turns out I was right. You've been mismanaging HOA funds for years. Funneling money into personal accounts, falsifying budgets, using HOA fees to pay for things that had nothing to do with neighborhood upkeep." Karen slammed the papers down on the desk. "You can't prove anything." Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Karen, I'm the sheriff. You really think I wouldn't do my homework? I've got every transaction, every forged document, every shady deal you ever made. And trust me, once the IRS gets wind of this, they're going to have a field day." Karen shot to her feet, her face a mixture of panic and rage. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she hissed. Jake leaned back in his chair, completely unfazed. "I think I do. And I think you know exactly what's coming next." For the first time since this whole mess started, Karen looked genuinely afraid. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. Jake let out a breath, rubbing a hand over his jaw. This wasn't over. Not yet. But he had the upper hand now and he wasn't about to let go of it. Karen had thought she was untouchable. She had thought she could cheat and manipulate her way to the top without consequence. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had underestimated the wrong man. Jake knew that Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. People like her never admitted when they were beaten. They scratched and clawed and screamed about injustice right up until the moment reality slammed into them like a freight train. But Jake had patience and he had the law on his side. He wasn't just going to bring her down, he was going to make sure she felt every inch of the fall. The first step was getting everything in motion. With the financial audit exposing Karen's years of fraudulent activity, Jake passed the files to the district attorney. It didn't take long for them to see the clear-cut case of embezzlement, tax fraud, and real estate fraud. Arrest warrants were being drawn up, and Karen's reign of entitlement was about to meet its inevitable end. Meanwhile, Greg Tinsley, the smug developer who had thought he was on the winning side, was about to have his world turned upside down. After Jake had shut down the construction site, Greg had done what greedy men always did. He called his lawyers. They had tried to push back, claiming that the sale had been legally approved and that Jake had no authority to interfere. But Jake had been ready for that. With one call to the state's attorney general's office, he had made sure that the fraudulent land sale was not only halted but that Greg himself was under investigation for knowingly purchasing stolen property. Greg had been confident at first, laughing off the accusations, but when the feds started freezing his accounts and seizing documents from his office, the laughter stopped. When confronted with the overwhelming evidence, he did what all cowards do, he flipped. Within a matter of days, Greg had turned on Karen, handing over emails, messages, and signed contracts that proved she had orchestrated the entire scheme. He gave up everything in a desperate attempt to save himself, but it was too late for both of them. Karen's downfall came swiftly and publicly. The morning of her arrest was one the town would never forget. She had strutted into the HOA office as if she still held any power, snapping at the board members and barking orders about damage control. She had no idea that the sheriff's department had already surrounded the building. The moment she stepped into the conference room, Jake walked in after her, a pair of handcuffs dangling from his fingers. Karen had barely managed to sputter out a protest before she was placed under arrest. She shrieked, kicking and flailing, demanding to speak to someone in charge, but the cameras were already rolling. News reporters had gotten wind of the scandal, and the whole town watched as their self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was dragged out in handcuffs. The irony was almost poetic. As she was shoved into the back of a police cruiser, she twisted around, her face red with rage. "You can't do this to me. I built this town. I make the rules." Jake leaned down, resting his arms on the open window of the car. His voice was calm, steady, and laced with just the right amount of satisfaction. "You're not the law, Karen. You never were." With that, he closed the door and the cruiser pulled away, taking her straight to jail. Greg didn't fare much better. Though he had cooperated, his hands weren't clean. He was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud, and attempted land theft. His shiny reputation crumbled overnight, and his business partners abandoned him faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship. Within weeks, his development company filed for bankruptcy, and his luxurious lifestyle came to an abrupt end. The HOA itself didn't last long after that. With Karen gone, her loyal cronies scattered, trying to distance themselves from the mess. The town's homeowners banded together, pushing to dissolve the HOA entirely, and without Karen's iron grip, they succeeded. The association was disbanded, and for the first time in years, people were free to make their own choices about their homes without fear of ridiculous fines and absurd restrictions. As for Jake, he didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Justice had been served, and that was satisfaction enough. But he did have one last move to make. A month after Karen's arrest, Jake stood on his land, the land that was rightfully his, watching as workers removed the last remnants of the fraudulent development project. He had bought out the few parcels of land that had been affected by the scam, ensuring that no one else would ever try to take what belonged to his family again. He decided to leave a little reminder of what had happened. At the entrance to his property, he had a large sign installed. It was simple, but it sent a clear message. Karen's Folly, private property of Sheriff Jake Carter. The name spread through town like wildfire, becoming a running joke among the locals. People would drive by just to take pictures, laughing at the legacy Karen had left behind. Even in prison, she couldn't escape the humiliation. Word had it that Karen was struggling to adjust to her new life. Gone were the luxury cars, the designer clothes, and the illusion of power. Her fellow inmates didn't care about her past status. She was just another criminal to them. Rumors circulated that she had tried to take control of her prison block's social hierarchy, attempting to establish herself as some kind of warden of order, but it had backfired spectacularly. Greg, on the other hand, had managed to negotiate a lesser sentence by testifying against Karen and the corrupt officials who had helped approve the sale. But it didn't change the fact that his name was ruined. He would never work in real estate again, and any hope of rebuilding his reputation was long gone. With everything settled, Jake finally found himself able to relax. His land was safe, the corruption had been exposed, and justice had been served. Life in town slowly returned to normal, though it felt lighter, freer without the weight of Karen's constant interference. One evening, as Jake sat on his porch, sipping a cold drink and watching the sunset over his fields, a familiar truck pulled up. It was his deputy, Mark, grinning as he stepped out. "Thought you might want to hear the latest gossip," Mark said, dropping into the chair beside him. Jake smirked, raising an eyebrow. "Something good?" "Oh, you're gonna love this," Mark said, chuckling. "Turns out Karen's been trying to file complaints from prison. Says the food isn't up to neighborhood standards, and she's demanding a new warden because the current one isn't running things properly." Jake let out a slow, deep laugh, shaking his head. "Some people never learn." Mark laughed along with him before glancing toward the sign at the edge of the property. "So, you gonna keep that up forever?" Jake took a sip of his drink, letting the coldness settle in his chest. He looked out over his land, the place that had been in his family for generations, the place that had almost been stolen from him. Then he turned back to Mark with a small, satisfied smile. Yep. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the last rays of light illuminated the sign, standing tall and unshakable, a monument to justice, karma, and the downfall of the most entitled woman the town had ever seen. And Sheriff Jake Carter leaned back in his chair, knowing that his land and his peace were his once again.